Today, we're exploring the fascinating helical Mobius construction. The wonderful Mobius shape creates a flattering fold in the front while hugging the back smoothly, from small cowls to large shawls. First, we'll set up the general construction and start out with my variation of the Mobius cast-on. Then we'll work the dune stitch and transition to the windy dunes to highlight the unique reversibleness of Mobius. And at the end, we'll add a contrasting cast-off edge to make the Mobius pop. At the end, we'll briefly explore stitch pattern considerations and swatching for successful helical Mobius projects. In the first Mobius video, we explored the transverse Mobius construction, which is knit flat back and forth in rows, given half a twist and grafted. The helical Mobius construction, in contrast, is related to circular knitting and is worked in a spiral, actually a double circle spiral. By starting the cast-on in the middle of the fabric and taking advantage of the single edge of the Mobius shape, each complete Mobius round of knitting increases the fabric by 2 rows of knitting. To handle the double circle of the edge, most tutorials suggest using an extra long circular needle, at least 100 centimeters long. If you're like me and find circular needles with 80 centimeter cables the most comfortable and useful for knitting projects, we'll use 2 80 centimeter circular needles instead. Ideally, they should be the same gauge and material. You can compensate with your tension if you have 2 slightly different gauge needles. In order to tell them apart for this video, I'm using one 5mm steel circular needle with a steel cable and one 5mm bamboo needle with a plastic cable. I'm using one ball of Uptown Worsted by Universal Yarn. So let's knit. I'm not a fan of slip knots in my work. I'm using one here to hold the initial yarn end in place temporarily. I'll pull it out in a few rounds so we won't count it as a stitch. We'll use a yarn over double-sided cast-on. Slide the slip knot to the steel cable. I'll use the bamboo needle to create the stitches. I'll show each step at least twice. We'll create 2 sets of 2 stitches in each cycle. The first stitch is a yarn over on the working bamboo needle, followed by a yarn over under the cable, which creates 3 more stitches. There are 2 stitches on the bamboo needle now, and also 2 stitches on the steel cable, not including the temporary slip knot. Let's do that again. Yarn over the working needle, needle forward and dip under the cable, and yarn over again. Now we have 2 more on the needle and 2 more on the cable. You can see that the yarn overs on the working needle are mounted like regular stitches, open to the left for Western right-handed knitters like me. If you flip the cable over, you can see that the first stitch is also oriented this way, but the second stitch is backward. This will come into play on the first round of knitting when we're knitting on this side of the cast-on. For the Windy Dunes stitch pattern, cast on any multiple of 12 stitches, counting only the stitches on the needle. With this yarn, working with at least 60 stitches on the needle makes the Mobius easier to knit, especially at the beginning. For this explanation, I'm using 72 stitches, and for the larger Mobius cowl, I used 96 stitches. Including the stitches on the steel cable is the whole Mobius round and is twice as many, so 192 for the cowl, which is 48 cycles of 2 sets of 2 stitches. If you cast on too tightly, it will be difficult to knit into. If you cast on too loosely, you will notice it in the middle of the work. The tension will shift easily from one yarn over to the next, so it will even out somewhat. Using the cable rather than the needle will also prevent a loose cast on. Now comes the Mobius magic. Holding the working yarn secure on the bamboo needle, carefully slide the stitches along the cables. Notice that we have half the stitches on the plastic cable and half on the steel cable. Rather than using only the bamboo needles and knitting in a simple circle and making a cylinder, to create the half twist needed for the Mobius, using the same working bamboo needle, we want to cross over and start knitting into the other side of the cast-on, which is from the steel needle, with a slip knot. In this way, we will make one continuous path of stitches transversing 2 twisted circles. Starting with the 2 cables parallel and not twisted, for a traditional female closure, the steel needle should slant up to the left in the front on the outside of the plastic cable. This is for right-handed knitters. For left-handed knitters, this will be up to the right on the inside of the plastic cable. For traditional male closure, this steel needle will be on the inside for right-handers and on the outside for left-handers. After the setup and first half Mobius round, it gets easier, so hang in there. Keep shifting the stitches until you can connect the working bamboo needle with the steel needle with a slip knot. Don't worry about the other two needle ends, we'll get to them in a bit. We'll slip the slip knot for the first round. We'll take it out when we get back around to it next. If you have enough hands, you can place a marker. Otherwise, we'll place a marker on the next round when we take out the slip knot. The first round is all knits. Knit into the yarn over. The next stitch on the needle is oriented backwards, as we noticed when we were casting on. Knit into the back loop so it isn't twisted. Continue knitting around in this way, shifting the stitches as required. At this stage, the Mobius shape is still a bit fragile, so be careful of how you move the other two needle ends. Keep the cables together. When you have knit about halfway around the circle, you will notice that the other steel needle end is starting to inch out of the fabric because we're knitting the stitches off of the steel needle. If you continue to knit, all the stitches will end up on the bamboo needles and it will be too curled to be able to knit with. So we'll secure the stitches on the bamboo needle and switch to the steel needle. Now we're knitting with the other end of the steel needle and off the same steel needle as before. It's a bit like working in the round with double-pointed needles. After knitting another half circle, you will reach the end of the stitches on the steel needle. You will notice that there is still half a circle of stitches on the steel needle and 1.5 circles on the bamboo needles. We will continue to use both needles to knit all the Mobius rounds, about 1.5 circles before we switch. You will also notice the slip knot and stitch marker on the plastic cable. This indicates that we've knit 1 circle or halfway round the Mobius round. Lastly, you'll notice that the next stitches look different because we have already knit into the other side of the cast on for these stitches. So let's keep going. Now we're knitting with the steel needle off of the bamboo needle. Because the Mobius has a half twist that connects all the edges, you will notice that every so often you need to roll the fabric and the needles through the middle, so the part of the edge you are knitting is on the outside. Continue being careful with the other two ends. Make sure to keep the cables together. After another half circle, we will pass where the other two needle ends meet. Now, half the stitches are on the steel needles and half on the bamboo needles. After one more half circle, we've reached the slip knot and completed one entire Mobius round. Carefully drop the slip knot and pull it out. When we weave in the ends, I'll show you how to close up the hole. If you don't have a stitch marker in yet, make sure to add it now. Knit a few more stitches to secure the stitch marker. You can see there is half a circle of stitches on the bamboo needle, so we should switch back to the bamboo needle. Continue knitting in this way, switching needles when about half a circle of stitches are left. Knit 3 Mobius rounds in total. As you knit, you will notice after each Mobius round, a row of purl-looking stitches appear on the opposite cable on the other edge. You can use a round to double check your stitch count if you like. Now purl 2 Mobius rounds, again switching needles when you have about half a circle of stitches left. Now knit-looking stitches appear on the opposite cable. Although it's clearly part of the Mobius round, we'll explore how the stitches are formed later in the video when we look at stitch pattern considerations. This video is actually an in-depth exploration of this project I showed in my video on the dune stitch. If you like the dune stitch pattern, you can make this project by adding a third purl round and then working a repeat of 3 knit rounds and 3 purl rounds until you're happy with the width. End after 3 purl rounds and skip to this timestamp for a contrasting edge and cast off. Otherwise, let's transition to the Windy Dunes for something new. The Windy Dunes pattern is a 12-stitch 6-round repeat that uses knits and purls to create wind-blown dunes. Knit flat, it's a 3-row repeat. I'll give the instructions at the very end of the video. Round 1, repeat, knit 2, purl 8, knit 2. Note that the knit 2 ends combine into knit 4 across the repeats. Round 2, repeat, knit 4, purl 4, knit 4. Now the knit 4 ends combine into knit 8 across the repeats. Round 3, repeat, purl 1, knit 4, purl 2, knit 4, purl 1. Here, the purl 1 ends combine into purl 2 across the repeats. Round 4, repeat, purl 2, knit 8, purl 2. For this round, the purl 2 ends combine into purl 4 across the repeats. Round 5, repeat, purl 4, knit 4, purl 4. In this case, the purl 4 ends combine into purl 8 across the repeats. And round 6, repeat knit 1, purl 4, knit 2, purl 4, and knit 1. Finally, the knit 1 ends combine into knit 2 across the repeat. You can see in the diagram that the steps alternate for each round between 1 stitch across and 2 stitches across, so the dunes are flatter and rounder. Also, in each column there are 3 knits and 3 purls in stacks, so it's not hard to read your knitting. For the cowl, I have knit 4 repeats of Windy Dunes with an additional round 1 and round 2. To finish the dunes and set up for the contrasting edge and cast off, work 2 more rounds straight knits and 1 round straight purls with the main color. Now switch to the contrasting edge color and work 1 round, repeat, yarn over, knit 2 together. One more time, yarn over, knit 2 together. In the video on the beehive stitch, you can see the details of this wonderful technique. The fundamental stitch structure is the same. As the contrasting color grows around the edge, you can clearly see the direction of the knitting as the Mobius round progresses. That's what we'll explore right after the cast-off. I've used a variation of the Icelandic cast-off. I find it stretchy without puckering, and I like the small scallops on the edge. To start, purl the yarn over. With the yarn in back, slip it back, and knit through it as per the normal Icelandic cast-off. For the next stitch, bring the yarn forward before slipping the stitch back. Now purl the stitch through in a similar way. Let's do that again. Yarn back, slip the stitch back, knit through the stitch. Yarn forward, slip the stitch back, purl through the stitch. Continue all around the Mobius round, ending with a knit on the last knit 2 together from the row below. Cut the yarn, leaving a tail for the main color and the edge color. For the contrasting edge, back out half the stitch and then mirror the stitch definition by creating a loop to close the gap before returning through the stitch and before you weave in the end. At the initial yarn end, close the hole by backing out the first stitch and mirroring the 2 knit stitches. It's not completely seamless, but it looks quite nice. In the next section, we'll explore 4 important considerations for helical Mobius stitch patterns. I've created a swatch of a small section of the Mobius to illustrate. I'm using a contrasting color to highlight where the cast-on is. Firstly, it's tempting to think that, like flat knitting, the progress is in this direction for the first circle, and then back in this direction for the second circle of the Mobius round. However, as you can see, when the contrasting color comes around for the second circle, the knitting is in fact in the same direction for each circle of the Mobius round. On the first circle, the work progresses in this direction, and on the second, on the opposite side of the cast-on, the swatch is flipped up and the work progresses in the same direction. For this project, because of the tiling nature of the stitch pattern, I decided to start the pattern in this round and end in this round, so that the Windy Dunes start and end nicely on both sides, and the larger sections of the stockinette and reverse stockinette at the transitions are balanced. Secondly, a key aspect of helical Mobius knitting to consider is what's happening at the cast-on. As you can see in this diagram and the contrasting cast-on color, the stitches on each side of the yarn over double-sided cast-on are jogged by half a stitch. This causes a discontinuity at the cast-on that is hard to hide. Making it a feature can also be tricky. Garter or dune stitch are definitely the best at incorporating the cast-on, and as you can see with this project, form naturally on each side of the cast-on. Thirdly, because it's a form of circular knitting, the spiral nature of the knitting creates a one-row jog at the join of the round. As you can see, the Windy Dunes is not quite seamless at the join in the round. If you don't mind the half-stitch jog at the cast-on, you can use moss stitch and make it seamless in the round with an odd number of stitches. This is easy to do with a single additional yarn over at the cast-on before you start knitting. I don't suggest using the slip knot as a stitch, as it's ugly. And finally, each cycle for the Mobius cast-on we use for this project adds 4 stitches grouped in 2 sets of 2 stitches to the Mobius round, so this needs to be taken into consideration for stitch repeats. The Windy Dunes is a multiple of 12, which is even. Feel free to leave a comment with ideas for helical Mobius stitch patterns. I'm working on a different Mobius cast-on that solves some of these issues. Look for a video when I've got all the twists worked out. For the next video, I'm featuring a cozy stitch pattern that I've named the Smile Stitch, because the crescents remind me of the smile of the woman the stitch was developed for, my daughter's new mother-in-law. So pick up your knitting and create something awesome. I'll do my best to respond to comments, and I'd love to hear about your favorite reversible knitting pattern. Also feel free to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more awesome reversible knitting. For those of you still here, the last few years I've been working hard to find simple ways to feel better, what I call my daily well-being practices. This is not medical advice, I'm just sharing what works for me. Today's well-being practice is about the power of spirals, and specifically self-reinforcing feedback loops. The idea is that action leads to more of the same action, which leads to more of the same action. The key to well-being is to make sure that the action, or behavior, or thought is positive to reinforce more positive. I've noted before, if we're feeling unmotivated, then 5 minutes of cleaning can lead to more cleaning. If we treat people with respect, then we feel respect for ourselves. And also the importance of gratitude, which helps our mind focus on the positives in our lives. It is easy to fall into a negative self-reinforcing spiral, and we should be on guard against this and Mobius ourselves back to positive. It's much more rewarding to knit up a project than to rip it out. Have an awesome day! Today's well-being practice is about the power of spirals, and specifically self-reinforcing feedback loops. The idea is that action leads to more of the same action, which leads to more of the same action. The key to well-being is to make sure that the action, or behavior, or thought is positive to reinforce more positive. I've noted before, if we're feeling unmotivated, then 5 minutes of cleaning can lead to more cleaning. If we treat people with respect, then we feel respect for ourselves, and also the importance of gratitude, which helps our mind focus on the positives in our lives. It is easy to fall into a negative self-reinforcing spiral, and we should be on guard against this and Mobius ourselves back to positive. It's much more rewarding to knit up a project than to rip it out. Have an awesome day. And what? Mobius ourselves back to positive? Oh, that's a little weird.